I'm Stephen. I'm Stephen Miller. I'm the Director of Impact and Learning at How to Change, and really pleased that you're able to join us today for this session where we're going to three great organisations about their work developing place-based indices. So I think the local elections last week showed that deeply about where they live, and so we saw interview after interview showing people explaining why their head voted this way or that way, often citing the challenges their local areas face, whether that's jobs, schools, health, policing. In many areas there's risk of high street in decline, and we're also seeing a shrinking number of community spaces, whether it's pubs or village halls or post offices closing. But many people also express their hopes and aspirations for the things that could be improved. And that's part of what we work on at How to Change, and we're supporting a growing movement of communities to take back control of their local areas through businesses. They may be buying the last pub in the village, running their local football club, or saving their public halls and libraries. And there are over 11,000 of these community businesses concentrated in the most deprived neighbourhoods in England. Now, while our grants can support individual community businesses, we're also interested in
improve their surrounding areas and improve the places in which they're located.
But the challenge is building an evidence base that captures, both the context and the challenges, but also helps us understand the changes over time at an area level in order to show the impact of that community business activity. And it was really in our quest to address these challenges that we developed an enthusiasm for place-based data. And as a result, we've collaborated with a range of organisations to improve the quantity and quality of place-based data available. So I'm really pleased to have three of those organisations joining me today to talk about the indices they've developed and how we can support places to use data to address the challenges they face. So we have Liz from the Centre for Thriving Places, who will talk about the Thriving Places Index, which is a framework for measuring local conditions for wellbeing and whether those conditions are being delivered fairly and sustainably. We have Kirsten from Social Investment Business, who will present their work using credit and debit card transaction data to track the impact of COVID-19 on James from Onward, who will present their work developing the Social Fabric Index, identifying not only the places which demand the greatest attention, but the communities whose strength offer lessons. So I think that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to the others to introduce themselves properly. Maybe Liz, could we start with you, and you can tell us a little bit more about your work?
Of course. Hi, lovely to join you all. Thanks for that, Stephen. I'm Liz Zeidler. I'm one of the co-founders and currently Chief Executive of Centre for Thriving Places. Some of you may have known us in our previous iteration called Happy City. We've been going since 2011. And our overall aim as an organisation is to really help shift, in a big way, the whole economy from a kind of really strong focus on this consumption-based GDP growth model. That in somehow or other has become our ultimate goal and our ultimate measure of progress, and shift that towards our collective aim through all of the work that we do across the economy, being about growing the well-being of people, place and planet. Our focus, particularly as an organisation, as you probably know from the name, is about places. How do we support that shift to happen, not just at the kind of national level, as we're seeing in places like New Zealand and elsewhere, but actually at a local level? Do we have to wait for national governments and global G7 summits to agree this kind of shift? Because we might be a long time waiting. So how do we support places to make this shift now? And one of the ways we do that is to try and make it really practical. So we have developed a series of different tools and support services and research, etc., to really help people to say what difference does it make to start having well-being outcomes, and I mean that in the broadest possible sense. What are the right conditions for well-being at the heart of decision making at a local place, and how can we make that really practical? So this is a very short introduction, but I was asked to just show you quickly can you see that? I hope so, yeah. Our key index is the Thriving Places Index, which map of it here. So this index is designed to answer 3 big picture questions. Are we creating the right local conditions for people to really thrive? And then are we doing that equitably? And are we doing it sustainably so future generations can also thrive? And then beyond that, underneath those headline questions, which are in themselves quite a powerful intervention at a local level if people start making decisions based on those questions, is a huge range of data. I think there's currently 60 plus indicators within the index to try and get down to the nitty gritty of that. What does that mean at a community level, at a local project level, but also at a place-based level across this whole range of different indicators that you can see here, which allows everybody in a place to have their part in creating this new paradigm, this new thriving places way of working. And we publish this data. It's all data that's nationally available from lots of the big agencies, but we pull together the key things that research says makes the biggest difference to people's capacity to thrive. And we publish that for all 373, I think it is at the moment, local authorities in England and Wales, as well as work a lot with many of those to try and really help that change to get embedded into the kind of ways that places work, the ways they think and act across all sectors. I'm happy to talk much more about that as we go forward, but that's the general gist.
Great, thank you very much, Liz. That's really a helpful overview. We'll go into more detail soon. Kirsten, would you like to sort of introduce your work at Social Investment Business?
Sure, thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Liz. So hi, everyone. I'm Kirsten Mulcahy, and I'm head of the Data Lab at Social Investment Business. The Data Lab is all about using data to try and make better decisions in support of the most vulnerable people and places across the UK. And as we are kind of housed by SIB, we are most interested in understanding how social investment and grant making and working in partnership with our social sector organizations in the local economies could best support those kind of social economy objectives. And over the last year, when COVID hit, kind of SIB as fund manager and social investor deployed more than, I think, £50 million in grants and loans to try and support COVID recovery. And the question on everyone's minds, and ourselves and our partners, was really, well, how do we identify those areas to get them the right type of funding in the right ways so that they can support the most vulnerable and those most affected by COVID of the last year, when we didn't really know how it was going to pan out. So that was kind of the background to us developing this local economy data set. And essentially what we did is to focus specifically on the economic effect. So we knew that there were many different ways to understand vulnerability of a place, and others, Liz and James included, were developing other indexes to measure other metrics in social health, etc. We focused on economic, and we used credit card data scraped from 6 different bank sources via our partners in Foku to track kind of in close to real time the changes in local economic kind of consumer spend, so we could see which areas were getting harder hit compared to the others. And all of that was in kind of, firstly, so that we could map those changes and understand how the economic effect of COVID was playing out on a very localized basis. So we actually had data at postcode level, although we bring it up to MSOA, then helping us to prioritize among that, and then obviously help us in dispersing and designing recovery initiatives. So just to say, I think our work is slightly different. It's more of a comparative data set that's kind of time series based. So we would have rankings, but those kind of change monthly, and I'll show you some of the findings in a bit. It's definitely much more specific. So I think the others have a bit more of a composite data set. Ours is really looking at credit card spend as a singular, which was purposeful. And yeah, so granular, we are on a place-based panel, but it's also, importantly, it was future looking. So we wanted to know which areas looked like they might have poorer economic growth, and consumer spend as a proxy, kind of a leading indicator for that. The information I'll share, kind of some of the tools and how we've kind of got that data out there, but there's also a lot online for you to go and have a look at. We had a wonderful media partnership with Tortoise, who've been really supporting us in getting out the data and the messages, etc. But we'll touch more on it in a bit.
Great, thank you very much, Kirsten. Yeah, I look forward to getting into that. And then James, would you like to tell us a bit more about your work at Onward and the Social Fabric Index in particular?
Thanks, Stephen. I'm James. I'm a senior researcher at think tank Onward. I do research on a number of policy areas, but most pertinent to this is the Social Fabric Programme, and in particular the Social Fabric Index. Our concept of social fabric is similar to social capital, but we can see and broader in scope as well. It includes economic and institutional variables, as well as aspects of the physical environment alongside the civic and relational. In particular, we wanted to understand how the social fabric of the UK, kind of behaviours, networks and institutions that sustain community varies from place to place. So to do that, we created contains 79 individual indicators, which are grouped into 21 elements, and they are in turn grouped into 5 threads, kind of along the metaphor of fabric. These were derived partly from the literature, partly from our prior research, but mostly from the deliberative workshops that we conducted in different parts of the country. To keep it brief, the 5 threads are firstly relationships, which includes volunteering rates, membership of formal groups, among other things. Physical infrastructure, assets like pubs, post offices, green space, transport. Civic institutions, which measures trust, election turnout, and the quality of, say, schools and GP surgeries. Economic value, which is things like employment and income, but also stability of housing tenure. Positive social norms, which includes things like loneliness, substance abuse, crime, and family formation. Yeah, so that's a good brief tour of the index, and I'll hand back to Stephen.
Much, James. Yeah, so as you can hopefully see, there's sort of a fascinating variety of work happening here across the organisations, and we really wanted to sort of showcase each different index and talk about the various ways that they can be used. And so that's my sort of first question to the panel. Really, is you know, what do you think are the sort of the key insights and opportunities that can be gleaned from place-based indices? So, you know, how do they meet the need that's out there? Who might use them? How can they use them? I'm not sure who'd like to go first. Maybe Liz, can I come to you?
You can. With a surname like Zeidler, I'm used to coming last in most lists, so it's quite nice to go first. Yes, I mean, there are so many, there's such a, I mean, the balance between need and uses of this is really interesting. There are so many needs, I think, out there that aren't being met by the current quite simplistic ways of measuring progress in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So this very, very sort of simplistic idea that progress is about increasing a number like GDP is so outdated now, and it's so destructive, because all it's doing is encouraging us to make decisions that actually end up increasing consumption, increasing climate change, and increasing inequalities across our system. So there's a really, really massive kind of systems level need for us to make this change. At a local level, what we found from all of the work that we did for, I mean, we've been doing this work for kind of 11, 12 years now, and all of the work we've done across the country and well beyond, there's such a strong need for these sorts of shifts to be made really practical. So a lot of our focus is how do we make this quite practical? And actually by using this new, so one of the things we've done is create something like an index that people can start with. We make sure that it's quite adaptable, so that I often think of it in a kind of fairly non-datary way, as like almost like, you know, you give a kid an outline picture and they can colour it in and adapt it and draw it. And so each place can add their own flavour and colour to this with their own local data and their local needs, etc. But actually we're giving a really strong, clear framework to start understanding what are the really, really key things. So I think the need there is for support to make this easier, because status quo is always easier to follow. I think that the ways this can and is being used, it's not just a kind of a possibility, it's being used in many, many places around the country already, is about, there's 3 or 4 different key ways. One is around creating really shared goals. I think it's really important that we have shared goals and shared outcomes across things. So we break down these silos, so we don't think health, economy, education. Those are all parts of the way that we produce thriving communities and thriving lives. So a shared framework, which a lot of people, a lot of systems, a lot of sectors can get behind, can really help that kind of multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral working to really support communities to thrive. It really helps us prioritise. Like all the time, you know, places have huge decisions to make, investment decisions, planning decisions, strategy decisions. How do we prioritise those to bring the maximum outcome for communities now and in the future, and for the future of our planet? real engagement, you know, by making it, by bringing in all of these different elements into one picture, you can really help a whole place to feel like it's all of our jobs to create a better place. And so it's almost like all of the different systems, whether you're the head of the fire service or whether you're a community worker or whether you know, work with prisoners or you're the mayor of a city, you're a collective workforce for a place, and having shared outcomes, shared ways of measuring progress against is really important in that. And also to really start collectively and fairly similarly mapping and measuring impact against a clear set of priorities, so that we can start seeing what does work. You know, we don't have to keep reinventing wheel. What works here, what works there, what doesn't work, how can we create much more shared learning both in a place but also across different places, which is why we publish it quite so widely.
Yeah, I know. I think, well, there's many good points. Type of data can influence practice, but also policy, and think about joining up across different policy areas and thinking about shared outcomes, etc., for greater impact. And I might come to James next to talk about the from your perspective, fabric index, and then Kirsten, I'll come to you last if that's okay. But James, did you want to sort of talk a bit more about how you know, what the sort of insights and opportunities that from the social fabric index?
Yeah. So we designed the index to be, I guess, as versatile as possible, and to cover people think about when they think of what's important to them for their sense of community, let's say. How it's used. Well, in theory, you could compare an area to any other. In practice, we've shared our data with local and central governments. I remember that we had researchers from the National Lottery Community Fund wanted to look at the correlation between an area's score on our index and project density and spend per head. So it really can do, I guess, anything with it you wanted to, as long as the kind of level of geography matches up. And these sorts of indices are also great because they can challenge our, I guess, existing notions, or at least add to our knowledge of certain places. You take, say, deprivation, IMD, which is itself a combination of many things, and look at, say Islington, which ranks, I think, in the bottom, like a most deprived decile, but actually it's slightly above average for social fabric according to our measure. Kind of ranks in the middle of the pack for relationships. Has good physical infrastructure, high density of good GP surgeries, and also fairly good election turnout, which are all things that we measure in our index. We found a few of these outliers where an area's deprivation rank is significantly higher or lower than its social fabric ranking, and so that can tell you where places where you kind of might think of as struggling aren't so much, and places we think of as not struggling so much actually are, in at least in some kind of more economic metrics. So yeah, data sets like this can help to, I guess, complete the picture, so to speak, and fill in some of the gaps in our knowledge about kind of geographic disparities and that sort of thing.
That's a really good point in terms of you know, some of the limitations of individual indexes, or some of the sort of models that we've relied on the past, in not always provided the most comprehensive picture. And I know that's something that you've been working on, Kirsten, is trying to, you know, use this novel data source to understand maybe you know, something else about the local area, particularly in terms of like hidden spending patterns and recovery and what have you. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Thanks. Yeah, so I think I am coming with the economic side, but the importance of why we're using this data in particular is that it's a measure of the size of the effect, and the granularity of understanding how COVID is playing out on very localized economies is particularly important. But I think it is that size does need to be coupled with existing kind of left behind places, vulnerabilities, etc. And together you kind of get a better picture of where you were before. Are the inequalities of the past getting exacerbated through the COVID effect? Yes or no? What is happening? So I thought I might actually just share some of the the work that we've been doing, because it is time series data. I'm hoping everyone can see it. Kind of last year, so what you're looking at here is the change in consumer spending patterns. Those that are red kind of show kind of deep decline in spending from kind of that month compared to the month of the previous year. Those that are green are where those there was still an increase in spend, which was few and far between in April, in the second quarter of last year when COVID really hit. And some of the insights that we found there was really that the COVID effect economically was kind of deep and quite broad. Economies went down to around, I think, 40% decrease in consumer spend year on year compared to the previous year. And those areas that were most significantly affected in the beginning were actually kind of the pretty university towns. So Oxford had kind of minus 60%-ish on consumer spend, kind of hit quite quickly when COVID lockdown and the lockdowns ensued. Then we moved to seeing that the small coastal resorts were really struggling. They lost their seasonal spend, they lost their daytime visitors, and that was kind of a big concern from a social and local economy point of view. As we move to quarter three, you can see the maps updating, and there was a bit of a bounce back. Spending returned when things opened up again. It is quite important to notice that bounce back was driven by low income earners, not affluent spenders. So affluent spenders still held back, and they still actually were saving more than they were spending. Then I won't go into all of the different details, but basically you can see on the map how areas kind of started losing some of their economic activity as things started to close down. But the most important part, and what I wanted to show on a really localized level, is that if you go and look into Liverpool, and I'm particularly going to, it's taking a little while to load, sorry. I'm clicking here on Birkenhead Central. You should see it on the left there. There's kind of the data that pops up. So I encourage everyone to go and have a little play around. But you could see that the Liverpool region, there's a lot of red that happened straight away. There was a lot of decrease in spend. But as the recovery happened in kind of the third quarter, Birkenhead as a high street really didn't recover at all. It's still very red there, if I can zoom in a little bit. And that led us to kind of ask the question of, well, why? What is happening in those high streets? How do we understand those local economies, and what more information do we need to understand on those local economic structures so we could better support organizations operating there? And I don't want to take up too much time, but I do have one more just to show you so that people can kind of see what they can also go and have a play around with as well. But this is the high street tracker that we've developed. And as a result of that type of information and seeing Birkenhead really being kind of not recovering as well as others, we developed this with Power to Change and AHF so that social investors are better able to understand how they could be supporting their social sector organizations in these areas who might be going through kind of struggling on different types of economic effects of COVID and the ensuing local infrastructure change. And the real thing to notice here is that in Birkenhead in particular, in April 2020, they had a really significant drop compared to the benchmark of coastal towns and the benchmark of national. So Birkenhead is the light blue one, and you can see that is dramatically lower than the other two benchmarks. And it's basically showing that when in an area in 2019, in that same month, they should have been doing slightly better than other coastal towns. So the seasonality of spend, actually when COVID, they lost a lot of that income. And the real question there is, well, what do you do for these type of smaller coastal communities who have lost kind of their whole income stream over an annual period when kind of critical earning potential during visitor seasons have been kind of cut out from COVID. So you can kind of see it in a little bit more detail on some of the other slides, and there's kind of other high streets, which I'll share the links, etc. But so the point there being, yes, we see changes, we see the size of effect. What do we know about that exacerbating existing vulnerabilities? What does that mean for us as social investors, as grant makers, as social sector organizations? How do we start to try and recover?
And I know that it's been really useful over the last almost a year now, since the project was first floated. So I would really recommend everyone to check that out. And we'll also be posting links to the other indices in indices in the chat as well. And I just wanted to sort of build on from that that point. So what we've talked about here in the round, and the reason why I was interested in bringing everyone together, is because improving places is more than just one-dimensional. So it's more than just economic, but it also involves well-being and understanding social infrastructure and the sort of the social fabric of a place. So the sort of cultural, social, economic, and the health, it all comes together. And so I was really interested in you, like hearing more from you about how your indices might help local and central government in achieving, this much sort of discussed ambition about levelling up, and really thinking about how these different agencies might use this data to support different places. And it might be that there are particular indices which you think are a priority and they should focus on, or you may even have some ideas about the types of areas that they should focus on supporting. So maybe if I come back to you, Liz, from the perspective of thriving places.
Thanks, Stephen. That's a whopper of a question in 3 minutes or whatever we've got. So the whole kind of levelling up agenda, I think, is very interesting. I think it's interesting on lots of levels. I think it's interesting that most of the focus is on economic levelling up, and I think one of the things that, in fact, James, just was really brilliantly talking about this moment ago. Of course, the economic levelling up is deeply important. I'm not for a moment suggesting that that's not, but actually, there's so many layers of this. What we find with our Thriving Places Index is that you look at any place in the country, and each place has strengths and weaknesses. Similarly to James, when we compare that to the IMD, you've got such extraordinary comparisons there, where somewhere you'd expect to really not be thriving has real pockets of expertise and doing something brilliant. And what can we learn from that and take that elsewhere? But I think it's also really, it's quite simplistic. I think there's something about the levelling up agenda, the way it's often talked about, that is quite divisive. So we think about it as kind of levelling up between north and south, or between, different kind of classes or demographics or something else. And actually, it's much, if we're going to do this properly, it needs to be much, much more nuanced than that. So there are pockets of what I would call need for levelling up across all of the different sort of subjects that we cover. Which areas have got that kind of resilience through the COVID analysis that we've been doing, which we've been doing with all sorts of different agencies, from government agencies and ONS and people like that, but also a whole range of different research bodies. We're looking at, which places, for instance, have really been resilient to things like loneliness. That's been a huge issue. What kinds of conditions do we create in communities that give us the capacity to weather a storm like COVID in a different way? Similarly with, things like having a sense of worthwhile, which is deeply important to your well-being, has really been influenced by the huge changes we've had to work and to social connection, etc., through COVID. And I think having a much more nuanced picture that we're starting to describe here, which we aim to provide with the Thriving Places Index, allows us to look at some of that data and then go, okay, let's look at those places. Have they got different levels of green spaces, or social connection, or better support services, or community hubs and things like that? So really starting to understand that the levelling up of our access to services, our access to each other, our capacity to thrive in a much broader sense is really, really important. And I think through all of that, we need to look at everything, which is what we do with the Thriving Places Index, through this lens of equity. So we've got all those local conditions, which include, the quality of our jobs, the number of our jobs, etc. So there's a nuance in there. And then we put all of that through this equality lens. So what impact is that having, not just on our equity of income, which is deeply important, but also our equality of health, equality of gender equality, ethnicity levels of equality, etc. How are we providing those conditions in a way that levels up within communities as well as between communities, so that we don't, we just done a big piece of work around creating this sort of index for local towns, but also for rural areas. And in rural areas, you get these pockets. It might seem like a beautiful idyllic, and at the headline level, quite a flourishing economic region. But actually, you get pockets of inequality of access, inequality of income, inequality of those social inequalities. So I think it's really, really important. We talk about level up. We're looking at it in a much, much more nuanced, complex way, because that's what's required in this deeply complicated world of ours. But we'll try and make that as simple as possible with the right data.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I read a report recently from Sheffield University, and they were talking about some of the inequalities within regions as well as between in the UK are currently, amongst the worst in the world, or the Western world.
Because we've supplied the data for upper tier and lower tier, if you look at the difference there, often an upper tier authority can look like it's getting it all right. You go below that to the lower tier level, and there are huge disparities even in quite small regions of the country. And when you take that down to town level and stuff, it's really, really fascinating. And I think that's why, as leaders at all those different levels, we need to be looking at this through that kind of lens as well.
Yeah, I agree. And James, from your perspective, then, what would you what would you advise in terms of how these indices might help sort of local and central government?
Yeah, well, I guess on the levelling up point, I guess it's as Liz was saying, a definitional question. There are loads of disparities, and we should care about all of them, I would argue. But I think the government takes it to mean reducing gaps in productivity, income, employment. And if you look at the methodology for designating priority areas, it's just kind of how the government at least is using indices in their own way. It deals with economics, basically, transport infrastructure, GVA per hour work, that sort of thing, which all makes sense given how the fund is designed. But ideally, it would take a broader view of regeneration than that. But the main problem with this is that the things you ideally want to measure are very difficult to measure. Things like volunteering rates, local organisations, loneliness, these sort of things, and the data are only really contained in surveys. So to generate local area estimates, you're going to have to model them in some way. The key for kind of making an index, I guess, useful is that it's reliable, local, and updated regularly, which the economic variables are. But that means it doesn't capture the full spectrum of things that people are concerned about when you ask them what's important to their local area. Say in polling and focus groups, people talk about pubs or libraries closing down, the quality of housing, people not knowing their neighbours anymore. And so our index is an attempt to quantify at a local level some of these questions around relationships and social norms, with all the difficulties that come with that. But I guess if we don't at least try to take a more complete view of regeneration and to incorporate other aspects, other data sources, there's definitely a risk that some places lose out because their problems aren't strictly a function of GVA per hour worked or unemployment or the transport network.
Yeah, I think this is good. Well, many good points there, and I think certainly your point around the things that we want to measure are difficult to measure is sort of true. Unfortunately, across the board. And then Kirsten, did you want to add to this?
Just a couple. So to reaffirm what Liz was saying, 100% agree. I think it's very much what we've seen, that places right next door to each other can be operating in very different systems. But then also to kind of share some sympathy for government who are trying to design interventions in response to that. How do you deal with that level of granularity of when you're seeing it, and design kind of funds to support, etc. So there's a bit of a tension there, and just to highlight. I think from the work that we've done, my call to action, I think, would be a little bit more around the type of data that's getting used, and could we start to be a little bit more predictive about it. So yes, it's very important to use those historical data sets and to use the information we have now, but could we also anticipate which areas might be getting harder hit in different ways, shapes and forms, and use that to integrate into who we are stopping from getting to that point through these levelling up agendas. So I know my policy colleagues at SIB have launched kind of a debt for equity campaign, because we're realizing that there's 1.6 million organizations or SMEs with kind of, I think it's like 75 billion pounds of government-backed loans now that have sustained them through COVID, but what happens when, or if they're in the case where they're unable to pay those back in less wealthy areas, and how could you maybe socialize that so we can protect those jobs and local economies in less wealthy regions, etc. So that's just kind of thinking. My point would be a little bit more about what data do we use to bring in to be more predictive as well. We don't have to look back the whole time. It's what else can we be a little bit more ambitious about.
I think like really good additions of almost foresight sort of capabilities, introducing them to help sort of preempt where some of the challenges may arise. And I know there's lots of questions coming in the chat and in the Q&A, and if you are watching and you do have questions, please either pop them in the Q&A or upvote the questions you want us to ask the panel, and we'll be coming on to that shortly. But some of the information around the I suppose like practical applications of this, and obviously part of that is of making these things work requires technical development, and also I suppose like cultural implementation and changing the way that people work and people think. And we've sort of touched on some of that in terms of policy making and how this evidence is integrated. So I want to come back to all three of you and ask you some more about this. But with your respective indices, what were the challenges that you faced in terms of developing them, and also if you can't answer about the development process in terms of implementing them and getting uptake. And Liz, maybe I'll start with you on that one.
Yes, indeed. So, I mean, there were lots of technical challenges. I think one of the things that's challenging is we're asking the world, if you like, and certainly very busy, stretched local leaders. I saw one of the questions is about, are people actually using this? And yeah, the answer is yes, they absolutely are. And they're all people who are absolutely as stretched as they've ever been. So making it possible for people to use this has been a huge challenge. So getting that balance between rigor, which is obviously deeply important when it comes to data, accessibility, so is this data regularly available, is it available nationally, etc., and some pragmatism to say this isn't perfect. If this was perfect, then people would have done it before, and bringing together things that are the best available proxies that we've got at the moment, and then augmenting it for people. I noticed in the chat somebody saying they're here from the Understanding Society survey. At a local level, we augment what's available nationally using brilliant tools like the USS. So that kind of balancing act is one of the biggest challenges we had at a technical level, because we wanted it to be rigorous, but we wanted it to be practical for people on the ground. And so we have brought together a lot of different types of into a single picture, and I think that's one of the biggest and most important steps that was required, because as you rightly said, there are huge cultural barriers. People need this to be, the people on the ground making these decisions on a day-to-day level, either in national or local government or in voluntary sector organisations and funders. They haven't got time to read, the hundreds of reports that are produced every single year on this sort of stuff. They need it to be quite practical and quite quick. So there's cultural barriers about business as usual, so much easier. We know how to do this. We've been doing, local budgets, local plans, strategies, etc., based on GDP models forever. We know how to do that. So how do we make that really practical? So the work that we do with people is to try and say, okay, let's work with your leaders, with your managers, with your partners, with all the different sectors in the community to say, okay, how do we collectively come behind this set of outcomes and agree which parts of this process that we're playing with, and how do we use these metrics in a practical way that may not be perfect, but that is a lot better than what we're currently doing, to give some of that nuance we all talked about being important in the first place, and to start testing a model that says, people and planet have to be our ultimate outcome. So how do we, whether it's easy or not, move towards that as quickly as possible? So I suppose, the biggest challenges were some technical, definitely. It would be brilliant. We work a lot with ONS, and it would be brilliant if everything that needed to be measured on this was already being measured and we could just pull it off a shelf. That's sadly not the case. So we do have to work a lot. And also, by the way, really importantly, with the people who are listening and the four of us, a lot of partnership working. We work with other data agencies and other people doing brilliant stuff like James and Kirsten and other people doing things. So let's make sure we're not too too much in that kind of old 20th century mindset of, ownership and competition, that actually if somebody else is doing something brilliantly, let's bring that in and make sure that people have got access to all of these different tools to try and make this transition as quickly and as smoothly as possible, because it's really urgently needed.
I think, again, lots of great points there, Liz, and I think the cultural stuff is really important, and then the need to start joining up more of the data and integrating it into decision-making ways we work. So I might just come to Kirsten first this time, and then there's a question in the Q&A about how you got access to the data. So obviously that's quite an interesting story. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, Raj, thanks for that. I think so. Basically, it is a private sector data set that we have socialized with the support of a social sector partner called Mfoku, and they were kind of the intermediary between a private sector who uses this credit card data, does a lot of the data cleaning, the scraping, the coding, the processing power to use it for private development of products, and we've been able to socialize it and kind of create. I think we paid for a portion of it, but it was relatively cheap for us to access, and now we've kind of been sharing it widely. So it was, and I hope that maybe there's others that are listening, if there's opportunities for us to be socializing private data sets in these ways. I've really seen the value here in kind of having that R&D and that spend kind of dealt with from someone else. It also helped some of our data challenges, working closely with those partners. So it was a great experience for us. I'd say the other challenges that we faced were a little bit more around kind of the fact that data is partial, and if you're wanting to explain the whole story, it's not only about the rank or the percentage change in spend that's happening in a place, but it is kind of what Liz was saying. There's so much more within the system that we need to understand. And from our side, we were getting data that was showing things were changing on a weekly basis on an economic level, and we really realized that to have that nuanced understanding of how things are operating in those local systems is hard, and we needed to draw on the support of kind of the charities and social enterprise that we work with to understand why it's the case. Has Morrison's just opened up down the road and there's a huge amount of foot traffic, and that's actually the reason for this? There's so many things that are happening in those local systems that us as data people kind of showing at a national level, we can't explain it all. So there's also an element of working with others to really get to grips of what we're missing, and explaining the mechanisms of why we're seeing certain outcomes in the data, because ultimately all of that is going to help us intervene in the best ways possible in future.
Yeah, that's a really good point there. And then, and James, would you like to sort of talk about your experience from the Social Fabric Index? Because obviously you had the technical challenge of bringing together all these data sets, and then some influencing work that happened around that as well to try and get people to use it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, technically speaking, the indicators in our index come from multiple sources, and they all use different units. Things like number of crimes per 1,000 head of population, or share of people who are unemployed, or number of, say, allotments in green spaces. They're all quite different. So to get around this, we normalize the data as a min-max rescaling, so that each indicator ranges from 0 to 10. 0 being the lowest score for a local authority, 10 being the highest. Then we can combine them in the way that's consistent, while still preserving the relative areas on each measure. And we try to use publicly available data where possible. So things like ONS, Ordnance Survey, and NOMIS as well online, all really useful resources. But for those things that don't exist in a sort of downloadable data set, we also use surveys, including Understanding Society, which is, it's an incredibly rich source of information on community relationships, behaviors, all sorts of great things like that. We also came across issues of I guess you call it patchiness, where cover England and Wales, or only England plus Wales plus Scotland. But overall coverage was pretty good across the index. We tried to make sure that was as good as possible. And we also decided to average data over the last 3 years where possible, to kind of smooth out any spikiness, or in cases where a particular year was missing. So yeah, I'd say the main challenge was trying to find enough kind of consistent data at local level, which covered the whole UK. Such things do exist, but yeah, really got to hunt around to find them.
I know from experience that is a consistent challenge, but yeah, it's great to see, you know, the sort of innovation that's happening in this space of trying to sort of bring more data in and understand these areas in a different way. So I'm conscious of we've got sort of 5-10 minutes left, so I want to bring some of the questions in from the audience. And James has got a question about specific examples of funders, grant makers, or other investors in communities using these indices to make funding decisions. So obviously, you know, I can talk from the perspective of Power to Change as a funder of community businesses, that you know, this is one of the reasons why we've collaborated with these different and how we can use this data to inform our own decision making, and we do that in 2 different ways. So both to understand the challenges facing areas where we already have existing investments, but also to then identify other areas where we may also make additional strategic investments. So all 3 of these indices have been really helpful for informing our work. But maybe if I come to you individually, and I'll do it more as a free-for-all this time, so feel free to jump in if you have any examples as grant makers or investors using the indices this way.
Yeah, shall I leap? There are lots. I mean, obviously we've been going quite a long time, so we work with lots of different people. So lots of the bigger funders, either officially or unofficially, I think, use the Thriving Places Index a lot. So we've worked quite a bit with the National Lottery, who are doing some really interesting stuff around much more place-based community work all over the country, as we all know. Obviously, Power to Change, Carnegie Trust UK are also real movers and shakers in this space. A lot of interesting stuff, particularly in the devolved nations, but also here in England as well. I think there's also a really big shift in the kind of place-based stuff. So more and more local governments are interested in this. It used to be a lot of people from kind of the public health side of local government or the community development side of local government who are interested in this. One of the interesting shifts we've seen, particularly in the last year, I should think, through the whole kind of Build Back Better, economic recovery. I mean, how many catchphrases do we need? But we've had a lot more interest, I think, from people heading up economic recovery teams. So the economic teams in councils are now going, hang on a minute, we do want, when we talk about Build Back Better, we don't want it to just be a bit of, you know, green or pink or rainbow coloured wash. We'd like this to be, you know, genuinely better. And what the hell does better mean? And how can we start properly understanding that without doing 10 years of research ourselves? So I think the sorts of work we've all been talking about today can really help people quite quickly start thinking through what on earth better means. And we've also, by the way, there's quite an interesting shift as well, I think, into a kind of local funding model. So there are quite a few places and regions that are doing some very innovative finance stuff around how do they fund, you know, long-term, much more systems level programs within their own regions. And again, there's a lot of interest there. We've done some really intensive work with 2 or 3 of those regions to really adapt the Thriving Places Index to be fitting their priority areas of action, the particular strengths and needs of that region, so that they've got a whole wealth of data beyond what's available nationally from us to really support decision making at quite a granular level. You know, who and where should we be investing to provide this really long-term future generation kind of lens to our grant giving. So I think it feels like a really big change at the moment. I mean, globally, there's a lot going on in this space, but even at a local level, it's exciting to see many more people coming forward for this sort of work.
I'll also jump in there because I think we've certainly seen it a lot, and there's almost 2 ways in which funders are using the information. So the one is from a descriptive sense. So how as social investors are we patient and flexible and responsive to those that we're working with already? How do we design new place-based funds using kind of descriptive data that from all these different indices to do so? But then there's also been kind of tangible use of certainly so the economic data in some of the funds that we've run, that SIB and Power to Change have run together. So essentially there was more than 65 1.5 million that was applied for in one of the COVID recovery rounds, and only 9.5 million to give out. So how do you assign prioritization of need? And this was one of the data sets, although it was not the only one, that kind of meant that people could filter through to phase 2 or stage 2. But it was definitely part of, all the other fund priorities around community business, etc. But it has been tangibly used as well, whether or not they were kind of a high economic effect area that community businesses were working in to support those areas.
Sorry, I lost my mute button. But yeah, that's all great examples, and I think food for thought there. And I just think the sort of final question I have for what advice would you give to anyone else seeking to integrate these indices into their work, or even develop their own? And maybe James, would you like to comment?
Yes. I would say, in terms of integrating them, although some of the way that they're constructed across all three of our work actually is quite straightforward and easy to use. Depending on the level of geography you're using, the local authority makes a lot of sense because that's how a lot of decision making happens. So yeah, the integrating into work is quite straightforward, I think, because of the way the indices are constructed. But for making them from scratch, I would say the preparatory work is the key. The kind of deciding exactly what you want to measure before you go looking for metrics. That's a lesson learned from my point of view.
Jump in. I think my piece of advice would be to start with a decision, and then use whatever data you have to try and help you inform that decision, because we need to make decisions today and tomorrow, and we can't really wait 6 months' time to have the perfect data. So obviously agile and adapt, and hopefully we get to the perfect data at some point, but kind of start with a decision you need to make and then go.
Yeah. Actually, my response wouldn't be that far from Kirsten's. At the risk of sounding like a Nike advert, I would say just do it. I mean, I think that there's a real sense. People see some of the things that happen in, for instance, New Zealand. That we've had quite a lot of work talking with, the Treasury and things in New Zealand, who did their amazing wellbeing budgeting there. That's had a transformative effect. It's not perfect, but it's had a transformative effect on the whole country. And they, to be honest with you, didn't necessarily quite know what they were doing before they started. They had a really, really strong sense they needed to move in this direction and shift the economy in this way. And they made this bold decision, put it out there, and built some structures around it. So what we've tried to do is try and make it easier to take that first step and say, this is the direction of travel. And as Kirsten and James have said, let's iterate from there, because it isn't perfect, but it's entirely possible, especially at a local level. And at the UK, we have got a lot of this really fantastic work already from all sorts of different agencies there to support you. So, just do it. Sorry to use the hackneyed phrase.
No, it's good. It's good advice. Very practical. Great. So I think we're sort of coming to the end of our time, and I just wanted to sort of reflect on some of the key themes, because this has been a really interesting conversation and quite wide ranging. But I think there's some key points that have come out, and you will have seen also that most of the indices have been posted into the chat function, and we've put the link to the Social Fabric Index in there too. But the thing that sort of struck me during is the opportunity here to look at places in a different way. So not just through one lens as dictated by one data source, but actually, understanding your local neighborhood and neighborhoods across the country in multifaceted ways, and recognizing exist, within and between them. And so I think that's a really useful point to take away about the practical applications of this data. But I also think these indices are potentially useful and potentially transformative in terms of thinking about how we support those areas to address the challenges they face. So not only sort of thinking about them in terms of deficits, but also thinking about them in terms of assets, what strengths they have tapped into, but also to, I suppose, again, think about their needs in a multi-dimensional way, and also to potentially predict need as well. And I think, Kirsten talked about some of that with her work. And I think all of that will hopefully contribute to, the points that James and Liz made around, supporting what exists within a place, but also helping to build resilience to future shocks as well. And I think if we're serious about levelling up or addressing regional inequalities, then that's part of the journey and part of the process we need to go through. So thank you all for those contributions. They're really helpful. So I think we're going to close the session now, but thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to James for and I do recommend that you go and visit the respective indices. And right, thank you very much.
Thanks.
I will. Thank you.